All right, so yesterday we left off with this. Remember I said that myelin sheath and nodes of Ranvier, they accelerate the neuronal transmission. Made the analogy, the metaphor that they're like those movable walking pathways at airports, right? This, again, is 224 miles per hour, not meters per hour. So that shows us that these impulses, they are traveling fast, right, throughout our body, our brain and our body and our nervous system. So we mentioned nodes of Ranvier. Again, they're the gaps between the myelin sheath here, the myelin sheath, the white fatty substances that surround your axon. Deterioration of the myelin sheath and nodes of Ranvier. A common disease associated with that is multiple sclerosis. You guys ever heard of multiple sclerosis or MS before? I had an uncle that had MS, and he ended up dying about my age. When I was growing up, the only thing that I could remember was he was bedridden the whole time. Anytime that we went to visit his family, he was bedridden. And what it does is it's a degenerative disease, and it breaks down your nervous system that way, and your ability to walk. Yeah, Gary?
We had an umpire during the summer who said he had MS.
Is that right?
Yeah, he was struggling over towards the end because it was a little hot.
It was a little high?
Yeah, it was like 105 degrees.
Uh-huh.
He came in
that plus...
I got MS. Like,
yeah.
This is a little tough.
Exactly. Yeah, I can understand that. So, yeah, it's you know, when you hear somebody that has that, you know, the future for them is fairly bleak. So, but all that, you know, understanding the biology behind it, that is breaking down the myelin sheath, maybe helps to make that connection there a little bit. All right, let's transition to neurotransmitters. Again, we had them with our bell work, chemical substances that transmit messages between the neurons. Okay, so you know, a lot of times we don't think about it all that much. You know, you were talking about photographic memories, right? You could even get even a larger perspective, like just, you know, highs and lows with our emotions, pessimism and optimism, everything that we have. A lot of it is contingent upon the type of neurotransmitters that our body is producing and how our body reacts to those neurotransmitters. Okay, this guy out of Lowy, he's the guy. You remember we said magic at the synapse? We described magic at the synapse yesterday. He's the guy that really started to understand that it's both a electrical component, electrical transmission, and a chemical transmission. He's the one that identified really the synaptic gaps or synaptic cleft in between neurons. And he's trying to figure out how do they communicate with one another if they're not actually physically connected to one another. Because it can't be just primarily electricity. It's got to be a combination of that and something else. And so it's got to be the chemical component. What does that mean then? It means, you know, neurotransmitters, right? All right. So we're going to go back and forth with this idea of a synaptic transmission. I'm going to show you some imagery and give you some specific notes. Now, again, I'm going to go through this fairly fast, so I encourage you to just listen to the verbal aspect of this. I've got a lot of this stuff written up here for my particular purposes, and it is posted on the website, so if you want to go back and copy it down word for word, that's fine. But the idea is just to get you an idea of what is the synaptic transmission. How does one neurotransmitter go from one to the next, from the axon terminal buds to the dendrite or soma of the receiving neuron. So inside the axon terminal, synaptic vesicles. You may want to write that down. Good test question there. Synaptic vesicles. It's a question that the majority of students have a tendency to miss. Okay. Sometimes these synaptic vesicles are called little bladders. So you may write that out to the side of synaptic vesicles. Little bladders. So your bladder inside of you keeps track of your urine, right? Well, the bladders inside of the neurons keep track of the neurotransmitters, okay? So if you want to think of that connection there. They fuse to the cell membrane of the wall of the axon terminal, okay? So let's look at the image for a second. So here's our synaptic, this is a synaptic vesicle. This is a little bladder, okay? So inside of it, your neurotransmitters are grouped together inside of those things. So they're not, you know, flowing independently throughout your neurons. They're grouped together in the synaptic vesicles. When it fires, when it's collected the ions, you guys remember that from yesterday, the permeability, it's matched up and it fires, then these synaptic vesicles are going to flow down. This would be the axon and the axon terminal bud. It's going to fuse through the cell membrane, and then it's going to expel the neurotransmitters that are inside of the synaptic vesicles into this. What is this? The synapse, right? Or more specifically, between these two is the synaptic cleft, okay? These are the receptor sites, right? They're made up of protein molecules that are on the receiving neuron. So this would be one of two things, two parts of a neuron. What would it be? The easy one is dendrites, right? The dendrites receive neurotransmitters from another neuron, from the synapse, or it could also be the soma. There are receptor sites on the soma. Okay, I want to make sure that you realize that as well. There are no receptor sites on axons. Okay, receptor sites on dendrites, receptor sites on soma. When the neuron fires, the action potential moves to the end of the axon terminal, triggers the release of neurotransmitters from the synaptic vesicles into the synaptic cleft. So I kind of already summarized that. The neurotransmitters cross the synaptic cleft and attach themselves to the receptor side of the cell body of the receiving neuron. I may be jumping ahead a little bit, but these neurotransmitters, they have specific shapes, right? They have specific shapes. The receptor sites have specific shapes as well, okay? So they have to match up based off the shape of the neurotransmitter, based off the shape of the receptor site. Do you guys remember that game when you guys were growing up? I know that I've got two boys at home, and we have variations of it. But the version I remember was it was like there was a ball, and you could open up, and all these shapes fell out, right? And then you had to pick up the shapes and put it back in the appropriate spot. That's what I think of with the neurotransmitters and the receptor sites. They have to have a specific shape, okay? Now, there are certain neurotransmitters that they act like a skeleton key, if you want to think about a lock and key kind of a metaphor analogy, meaning that the neurotransmitter shape is really special, and it can go to any receptor site, okay? And those are usually associated with drugs, okay? And so that's why drugs have a tendency to be a bit more dangerous than our consumption of just, say, regular food, okay? Because of what they will do to us, okay? Now, when the receiving neuron gets those neurotransmitters, that's going to tell the receiving neuron whether they need to fire or not, okay? So that's where we get into this idea of excitatory neurotransmitters and inhibitory neurotransmitters. We'll get to that in a second, okay? So this is really just reiterating that shape ideology or that shape analogy that I just shared with you, okay? I said that receptor sites on the dendrites or the soma, they're made of protein molecules. Again, they receive neurotransmitters of a particular shape. I like the little toy analogy. Some people talk about like a key and a lock analogy there as well. Okay? I also think of it kind of like it's a dating game as well. When those neurotransmitters are out there in the synapse, those receptor sites, they're looking for the best neurotransmitter that's out there in the synapse, right? They're not gonna, take the he's all right looking or she's all right looking, right? They want the best whenever it comes to the neurotransmitter that's out there. Okay. All right. So let's introduce the idea of excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. And the analogy here is copper pots with copper bottoms, right? Why do they have copper bottoms whenever you're cooking? The purpose is what? Yeah, it heats up faster, okay? So that's like an excitatory neurotransmitter. It makes us react faster. It makes us experience an emotion to a greater degree because of excitatory neurotransmitters. But then again, why are there rubber handles, on the utensils that you're using whenever you're cooking something? Exactly. You ever put a metal fork or a metal spoon in a pot before and then go grab it? Right? I've done that before and I've forgotten that, hey, it's a very conducive technique, right? So excitatory neurotransmitters cause neurons to fire. Inhibitory transmitters cause neurons not to fire, okay? So when you think about the ions, If you get an excitatory neurotransmitter, that means we're opening up the cell membrane, taking on those ions, we're going to fire, right? Inhibitory neurotransmitter, that means the nucleus says, nope, not opening up the cell membranes, no more ions, we're going to stick right here, okay? We're not necessarily going to change. We're going to slow things down. And there are good things for that, right? Give you an example. Acetylcholine, or choline, right? It is actually, this is a little bit confusing. It can act both as an excitatory neurotransmitter and an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So far right now we've been talking about acetylcholine with memory, okay? But acetylcholine also has a different function as well. In addition to memory, it is also for movement, right? Getting us up and going for our muscles, okay? So I want you to think about the analogy or the scenario that you're over here and you park in the south lot, right? Over on the other side of the football field. You used up your tardies already, and you're on your third one, okay? You're over there, and you just pulled up, what is it, 8:22, right? And you've got to get to class fast, okay? So what do? You grab your stuff, and you start hoofing it across the football field. You're that guy. Thank goodness for acetylcholine, because if you didn't have it, you wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, so it speeds us up with our muscles. Okay, then when you get to class, you want to calm back down, right? I mean, imagine what's doing to your heart? It's bum 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 bum, right? So what acetylcholine does is it works as an excitatory neurotransmitter for your muscles, but then for your heart, it actually works as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And thank goodness that it does that, because if it didn't do that, what would happen? Yeah, your heart would explode and you would die, right? Made it to class, but it doesn't last very long, right? It gets the best of you, okay? So, excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. All right, so where do these neurotransmitters come from? The cell body, the soma, is continuously producing them, right? The nucleus is determining what neurotransmitter is being produced. Unused neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, they're actually broken down into chemical substances, so those are the ones that are not so attractive to the receptor sites. So they're broken down in their chemical substances and then reabsorbed or absorbed by the axon terminals. So sometimes that happens. And then this one is a test question as well, so you may want to put an asterisk next to this. This is an exceptional situation. This is not something that happens all that often. All right, I want to establish that up front. It doesn't happen all that often, but sometimes there will be a neurotransmitter that's out there in the synapse, and it'll be sucked back up whole, right? Back up into the axon terminal bud. Okay, hence the image there. Sucked back up whole, back into the axon terminal bud, and again, that's a process called reuptake. Reuptake. Sound good? Again, that does not happen all that often. So it's sucked right back up in the axon terminal bud. All right. There are a variety of neurotransmitters. Approximately about 75, right? Chemicals could be identified as neurotransmitters. It does get a little bit complicated. You have certain types of hormones that could be sometimes operate like neurotransmitters and sometimes not. So it is a little bit wishy-washy and some gray area there. But we're saying approximately 75. We're not going to learn all 75. We're going to go probably about 5 to 8 of them. Sound good? And I've introduced a few of them to you already. Okay? So we already looked at acetylcholine, and I mentioned that it is both an excitatory and an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's excitatory effect on your muscle fibers for movement so that you can run across the football field and get to class on time. And it has an inhibitory effect on your heart so that your heart doesn't explode once you get there. Another example of this, how it's used in different type of contexts and different cultures. In some of the Amazonian groups in South America, they may not necessarily understand the science behind it, but they use it effectively. So they came across this chemical, curare, and they put it on the ends of their darts, right? And once you get hit with this dart, it blocks the acetylcholine, right, in your body. So what does that make you do? If it's all about movement, then you can't do what? You can't move, you become paralyzed, right? So to a great extent, if it's a high level of this stuff, you can die as a result of it, right? But if you're hunting something, like you shoot the animal, they can't move, you can track it down fairly quickly, and there's your meal. There are different groups, categories of neurotransmitters. One of the more common ones is this idea of monoamines, and this is where we get those three that we mentioned before, and even the fourth, serotonin's in there: dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and serotonin. Right? So dopamine, again, I want you to think of alertness and activity. You got Muhammad Ali there. He's got a high level of alertness in his ability in boxing. And then norepinephrine, epinephrine, that's your fight or flight response. Maybe that's why the boxing is in there. And then serotonin is our feel-good neurotransmitter. Remember, dieters have a tendency to have low levels of serotonin, and consequently, they experience depression as a result of that. Okay? There are other neurotransmitters. The most common excitatory neurotransmitter is a neurotransmitter called glutamate. 40% of the neurons in the brain produce glutamate. Okay? So most common excitatory neurotransmitter, glutamate. And then the most common inhibitory neurotransmitter then is an acronym, GABA. It's a really, really long word. So I don't even know it off the top of my head. So we're just going to use GABA. And it controls human anxiety. And it is amplified with the consumption of alcohol. You may write that down. It's a good test question there as well. Okay, so we've got to think about this scenario for a second. Right, so all of us have anxiety, right, to a certain extent. Some of us more so than others, right? And so if we don't have high levels of GABA in our body, we're going to experience higher levels of anxiety, right? And sometimes it gets the best of us, right? And then we ended up, paralyzed, and we can't do what we would want to do, right? So thank goodness for GABA. Then, if you add alcohol to the equation, it increases your GABA levels, and then what happens to your anxiety? It goes away altogether, right? And so what that does is it enables you to do things that you normally would be too fearful of doing, right? So sometimes, people are a little bit awkward in social situations trying to meet a significant other, and they wouldn't, do those things because the anxiety gets the best of them. So a lot of times people introduce alcohol to that particular equation so it gets rid of the anxiety. You can also think about college campuses. Sometimes you think about all the crazy things that happens on college campuses. There's a reason why crazy things happen on college campuses, because the introduction of alcohol, the decrease of anxiety levels, people do things that they normally wouldn't do. Okay? Last one we need to talk about is endorphins. It provides relief from pain during extreme exercises. And so you think about a runner's high. If you've ever experienced that, I know we've got a couple runners in here, right? You run extremely long distances, and then your body gets tired of trying to put up with all the pain for an extended amount of time, and so then it just starts releasing all these endorphins, and you get this feel-good high experience. It really is. It's a high that a lot of times the consumption of drugs is really trying to replicate that same high that you get with endorphins. Okay. Sometimes you see endorphins produced in traumatic experiences, like you've been wounded in battle or something like that, to try to compensate for the pain. Or you you hear stories about people, they have loved ones that are caught in a dangerous situation, like they're trapped underneath the car, right? And then they do some just crazy stuff, like crazy stories, like they lift like excessive amounts of weight, right? And there's this new interest in what's going on inside their bodies that allows them to do those type of things, like superhuman type of things, right? A lot of that is really reflective in his body's ability to produce endorphins. Okay. My video doesn't work, but I'm not sure if maybe I'll have to update it on the website. We had Frozen, and they changed the lyrics, and you had neurotransmitters in there. So it gave you an opportunity to memorize some neurotransmitters by listening to frozen. Okay. We've got just a moment left. Let's do this. If you're in the front row, go ahead and stand on this side of the room. And if you're in the back row, go ahead and stand on this side of the room. Okay? We're going to do a little quick activity. Jason, you get the lights for me, please? Does anybody have a quarter or a nickel or a dime